how much language we use that is shame-based, that is fear-based, that is guilt-based. You think of the long-term trauma it creates, is it worth it? Of course, appreciation and encouragement is a motivating factor. It's not as effective as fear, which is why we use fear. I met a guy in an organization, and he said, this year I have been to 600 temples. And I'm not joking, like literally he'd been to some 2 a day type. And he said, I am looking for peace in my life because my boss has driven me crazy with the demands and the threats.
Why is it so hard to forgive?
I think that's it, right? Is that we can't just, delete
Erase the memory of the hurt?
memory.
Can everyone be forgiven?
How can God forgive murder, horrible murder, genocide, pogroms, all of that? I'm taken to when Jesus was being crucified, murdered. Jesus said,
If we created psychological safety at our workplace as well as in our families, what would change in the family? What would change in the community? Have you ever walked away from a conversation thinking, it's better if I just don't say anything? Most people don't stay silent because they have nothing to say. They stay silent because it doesn't feel safe. Safe to be honest, safe to disagree, safe to say, this is how I really feel. And that's exactly what today's conversation is about, psychological safety. My guest today is Jonathan Abraham. Jonathan is a facilitator, trainer, and coach who works with leaders, teams, families, and individuals, helping them create environments where people feel safe enough to speak and express what truly matters to them. Today, we are not just talking about work or leadership. We're talking about homes, relationships, conversations between spouses, between parents and children, and people who want to be heard without being judged. Jonathan, it's a privilege to have you with us. Welcome to Courage Coach.
thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
How are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm well. Lots going on in life, but by and large, all well. Thank you.
Okay, let's dive straight into it. Why do so many people find it difficult to speak up even though things matter to them?
Yeah, this is something that is so prominent in many of the organizations I work with. And people say, I just don't feel like I can be myself. I don't feel like I can be honest. I think for many people, there's this sense that it's easy to say something that people will appreciate, or at least I think of the perception that people will appreciate it. But when it comes to saying something that may be looked down upon, or maybe controversial, or maybe someone will say something to me about it, then there's a question mark. And often when there is that, people just naturally hold back. And so what happens as a result of that is you don't have free-flowing thoughts and conversations, and sometimes closed environments and groups when they could be much more open.
What are they afraid of, actually?
I think many things, but often it comes down to personal relationships and the hierarchies that are there. In our South Asian context, when we talk about cultural studies, there's this power distance that they talk about. And in places like India, Bangladesh, Nepal, there's a higher power distance. And so if you could talk about the context of teams, people working in teams, talking to your boss about something that's sensitive or a problem at work is seen as it's just taboo. And you don't necessarily go directly to them, you'll go to someone else, or you just won't say anything. And that's probably the most common. And so I think the shame honor system that is everywhere around the world, often they talk about it in Japanese or Indian contexts, but it's really everywhere around the world. You have shame and honor. It's just to different extents. But that shame piece where you feel like you're going to be shamed, or there may be something that shames others too, that is where people tend to hold back and say, maybe I won't say this just for my own safety.
You know, the first time we met, I heard you mention the phrase psychological safety. Can you explain that a little in just in simple terms? What does psychological safety mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll explain it in my own words. And there are many definitions out there, and many good definitions. And I would say, so from my perspective, I would say psychological safety is an environment or climate where people can be open, they can be free to speak their mind without fear of being looked down upon, without fear of being shamed, without fear of being belittled. And they can make mistakes in that environment. And that's something they talk about a lot in psychological safety, is that are we able to make mistakes in this environment and where it's not completely put down? And so they're able to be free speech-wise, they're able to be free to make mistakes, and they're able to be free to even grow and learn from those mistakes and from maybe being innovative and thinking of something new and it's not put down. And so I would say that environment, and sort of a simple way, that is a safe environment. Because you put the word psychological, people often think, oh, this has to do with psychology.
Yeah.
But really it's not. It's simpler than that, but it's also, it has a profundity in the context of groups. And so I would say that mistake piece, that piece where it comes to just being open, and also I'd say just sharing new ideas and new thoughts that aren't necessarily welcome in different environments. And so to be just completely transparent. And so I would say that is a psychologically safe environment.
And why the term psychological or psychology comes in? Does it have to do with mental well-being or mental hygiene as well? That where you feel like all the safety, it's a lot goes on in mind, like, you know, shaming and all, it affects your mind, it affects your psyche.
Absolutely. I think there's a deep connection.
Yeah.
And again, when it comes to psychological safety, often they use the term in the context of teams. And so they'll say this is a psychologically safe team. And with that goes people's mental health and well-being, and just teams and who you work with and people you're close to, that affects your mental well-being so much. And so the context of people working together is so important to how we see ourselves and how we just feel. And so that comes down to the language that people use around us. And you said, you know, the word shame, right? And so that is just so important. Is like, are you shamed? That affects you. Are you belittled? That affects you. Is the motivation fear, which is low psychological safety? That affects the way you feel about yourself. That affects the way you think. And so there's a clear connection between the way you think and feel and the environment that you're in. So absolutely, yeah.
And what are the effects? Let's say somebody is in an unsafe psychological safety environment. What effects are there on that person?
Well, I would say, I mean, the way I often say it, there's sort of trauma with a capital T and trauma with a small t. And so those, you know, there's a spectrum. I would say trauma with a capital T is when they're in this constantly very low psychologically safe environment. And that is affecting their view on themselves over the long term. And so that is real trauma, you know, that by definition, that is trauma. Or there are environments where it's a mix, but they are at times shamed. They're at times put down for speaking up. And that, I would say, is often trauma with a small t. And so it has an effect. The how much it has an effect may vary, but I would say absolutely. I mean, I think it really does affect our mental state.
And Jonathan, how did you first get interested in this subject?
Yeah, it's actually quite interesting. And so I work a lot with different teams around the subcontinent. This is South Asia. And mostly in the context of the United Nations. I'd worked with their teams. Often they'll ask me to come in and work with teams that are struggling and help them really connect more, engage more, see what some of the problems are, especially teams that are in conflict. And so that I've been doing this the last 13, 14 years. And initially, as I was working with these teams, I would notice that people would say, I just don't feel open to say that. I just don't feel like I can say that to him. And usually it's a boss or even it's a coworker. And I thought, what is it that is stopping them from being open? Now, if you ask most bosses and you say, like, do you have an open environment here? Can people say what they want? Can they say what they feel? Most bosses will say, yeah, I think so. But it was really not what I was seeing. And so I was taken aback. The opposite also happened, where I would go into environments and they would point to either their boss or someone who's above them at work, and they would say, I feel like I can be natural with this person, and I wish everyone was like that. And so you realize just how much that affected the teams. And so I heard about psychological safety. Of course, it's been coined many years ago. Amy Edmondson has done a lot of work on it. The Google Aristotle project that came out in 2012, 2013, that was really what the big theme. And so as I researched more on teams, that these words just came out, psychological safety. And so that project, the Aristotle project, if you read through it, which is it's very profound when it comes to understanding how teams work, because they did it with 180 of their teams globally, which is the most functional, thriving teams. There's a standard matrix of what makes teams work well together, and psychological safety just came out as this big factor in what makes teams work well together. And so that's when I started to do research on this, but it was really as a result of saying there's dysfunction in these teams, and it seems there's dysfunction in how open people can be in the teams. It was when that happened, that's when I started researching, and I found, oh, this is all here. This is, people are talking about this.
Now, there is people stay silent because of maybe fear, shaming, and other things that you mentioned. So there is sometimes it's how do you differentiate between when you're supposed to when people are staying silent because of these factors, the adverse negative factors like shaming and these negative outcomes that they are foreseeing, or they're staying silent because it was not everything has to be said and might be destructive as well.
Yeah, it's hard to gauge.
Yeah.
Usually you get it from, I'll often go out with teams for 2-3 days, and it's usually not so much in the meetings. I mean, in any group of people, you have the introverts, the extroverts, people who talk a lot, people who stay silent. They have a lot to say. They have a lot of good things to say, but they'll be silent. And then they'll talk, in a smaller group on the context. And generally, they're more introverted. Whereas, if you have a big group discussion, it will be really mostly a few people who speak. And so you're right in that. How do you know the difference? Is just a personality thing, so maybe some people are quiet. It comes to gauges now, and this is where the onus is generally on the leader to ask, number one, does anyone have something more to say here? And not only do it in the context of a bigger group, but do it in the context where it's one-on-one, two, and creating that high psychologically safe environment where they can speak. And so you want to ask more questions, and you want to make sure when those questions are answered, you're not putting people down. You're not saying, that's wrong. You're actually just listening and being open. And so it is hard to come in and gauge that. But when people would come to me and say, I just don't feel like I can say this. Oh, and here's another thing that they would do. They would come to me and say, can you tell them this? So they would say, you're the trainer facilitator. Can you say this? Can you say this? The boss is in the room. Can you say this to him? Can you say, she's here, talk to her about, the way that she treats the employees, And so then I thought, okay, they want me to say it, but they can't say it. And so that's where I found it interesting. And that's really where I started studying more in psychological safety, because it's actually quite a dysfunctional environment when they need someone to come in and be open. And then I would hear that from different people, and sometimes different groups coming and say this to this, say this to them. And I thought, why is it that they can't just speak to each other openly? And that was where I thought, okay, there is some problem here, and it's really low psychological safety. Now, I say it's the onus is on the leader, but there is an onus on everyone in any team too, where you talk to someone and you speak to someone, and are you open in their response, even if it's negative? Are you asking questions about some difficult issue and allowing people to speak freely rather than putting them down? And we do this actually more than we think. And I'm talking about sort of putting people down subtly, belittling someone. I was in a team meeting just a few months ago, and we were talking, and one of my colleagues said something. I thought it was quite obvious, and I said to her, and this was in the context of a few other people who are present at the table, I said, "You didn't know that?" Which you would think, okay, that's quite it's quite a common phrase that we use. But then I just saw her eyes when I said that, and she goes, she looked down, and I sort of caught myself, and I caught myself thinking, why did I use that phrase? Why, you didn't know that? I know that. I'm the one who knows that. I have that knowledge. We know that. You don't know that.
Yeah.
What am I doing? I'm shaming her, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm not her boss. I wasn't her boss. I'm just a colleague. And yet I'm using this language, so the next time she speaks up about something that's maybe a little bit that we feel is obvious, that she thinks, oh, maybe this is obvious to others, she just won't say it. And so I've created, subconsciously, a little bit less of a safe environment for that team. And so I actually have to apologize to her for that, because I realize you catch yourself doing it. And that's the interesting thing, is just how much language we use that is shame-based, that is fear-based, that is guilt-based, that is belittling people. Often it's subtle. In fact, I would say most of the time it's subtle, but it's something that we do a lot. And this is where now, when I talk about psychological safety, especially in the context of themes, I said, what are the phrases we use that actually bring about and really, ultimately, what we're trying to do is we're trying to motivate people to change, which is not a bad thing, but we're trying to motivate them to change by putting them down a little bit. And like I said before, capital T trauma, small t trauma, and these are the effects of low psychological safety. Now, it may not have such a big effect, but on many people it does. And many people it really harms their mental health and can really affect their work. And so there's lots of these side effects that can come out of a low psychologically safe environment.
So somebody like you who is teaching about psychological safety and is aware of such terms, which you shouldn't use, like in your case, the example that you just mentioned, you who is aware of all these can slip as well. And think about people who don't have any idea. We're doing it almost every day, belittling and shaming somebody or the other. Do you see it happen very often around you?
Absolutely. And I would say, and again, going back to our sort of shame honor society, I would say it's the norm. I would say it's the norm in schools. It's the norm in organizations, that the way we want to motivate people, the way you want to motivate students in schools, and this is very typical, right, in our Indian school system, is that, if you do not do this by such and such a time, this will happen.
Right.
Or you better do this, or this is going to happen to you. And that is shame, it's fear, primarily fear, actually, in these contexts. And so that is very common. I would say it's the norm. And I wouldn't, it's easy to be judgmental and to say, gosh, we know this.
Yeah.
They don't do it like this in other places, but here we do it like this. I think it is part of the cultural setup. I think we have to ask the question: why am I speaking like this? Why am I trying to motivate people through shame, fear, guilt? Now, that said, it's effective. And I think that's why it's used. If you make a student fear, if you don't do this, you're not going to be here next week. That's a very effective mechanism. You're going to be kicked out. You're going to be suspended. You're going to be sent to the principal's office, and they're going to, give you a wacky or whatever it is. That's a very effective mode of motivating people, and I think that's why we default to it. Because fear is something that is used everywhere. But then, like you say, you have a sort of awareness of this and the effects that it has. So it has short-term fast effects, but then again, you think of the long-term trauma it creates. Is it worth it? And that would be my question. And my promotion of psychological safety, Vikram, is not we never use shame, guilt, fear. It's only that we think through the language that we use. And why are we trying to motivate people? I mean, we really think why, like with my colleague, so what was it that it was really to puff me up too, and there's an awareness piece in that. It's like, what is the language I'm using? Now, in schools, we use a very common parenting. It's very common, all around the world, is basically shaming. Why did you do that? This is a very typical phrase for a parent to say something. You spill something on the floor. Why did you do that? That's shame. Now, so that type of language, I think we can turn that. We can turn that to say, okay, is there a better way that I can motivate my daughter from not making that mistake again?
Yeah, we're going to talk about more about phrases and what kind of language is harmful in this environment. But before that, let's say somebody who is within that psychological safe environment, how does their behavior change?
Yeah, and this is big, and this is why we need to talk about it. Many things. Number one, when you tend to have a free environment, an open environment, there is innovation that happens. And so people feel free to come up with new ideas. They feel free to be great. How about this? Why don't we try this? Okay, we run this, video studio. Have you tried this type of short film? Let's do a little musical, And if you said, no, we've tried that. It's never going to happen. It's never going to work. Rather, okay, let me think about that. Right. And so that, and suddenly that person is saying, okay, I had a good idea, and it makes them come up with more ideas.
How do you respond to when somebody comes up, there is such environment, but the idea is really bad?
Yeah. And that's, I think you can be open still. Like it's not that you can't be open and saying, I don't think so. It's also the way you say it, right? Are you putting that person down for coming up with the idea? And saying, that's horrible, that'll never work, and it may be a horrible idea, but are you saying, thank you, not for now, and a lot of it's the way you do it too. And I hear this actually a lot. It's not exactly what she said, but the way that she said it.
Right.
I was thinking about this today, actually. I was going past, a store here in Dehradun, and they had these kulhad chai. And now they have kulhad coffee too. It's become very popular here. And it's, the same chai. I don't think they're selling any complete new recipe with chai, but it's in a kulhad cup, and there's something about that kulhad cup, right? That, it's sort of that sort of almost muddy, feel, but the texture, on your hand, that just makes the chai more palatable.
Yeah.
And that's why they're doing it with coffee now. That's why they're doing it with many other things. And it's similar to that. It's nicer to drink, at least from my perspective, out of a kulhad cup versus a disposable plastic cup, one of those little ones. You'd want that. It's how you frame it, right? Now, that's a simplistic answer, to the way we say things, but it's also what is the intent, right? What
Intent,
is
yeah.
behind it?
Right.
Am I trying to put them in their place, or am I creating that space for them to be open and to and okay, so that's partly it with the openness to ideas that brings innovation and creativity. But then if you're open to mistakes, right? We made a mistake. And some organizations even celebrate mistakes, right? To say we have something to learn from. We have
Right.
something that we can really use to move forward and to grow from. That's the intent, and when we have that mindset where we say, we can learn from this versus you made a mistake. This is going to happen to you. Here are the consequences.
Right.
There's a mistake. Let's learn from it together. That type of environment then leads to growth and development as individuals and as organizations. And they talk about, learning organizations in the context that I'm in. Organizations that keep on growing are able to innovate and develop well and help people grow and learn. That type of environment it can create. And so innovation is one, growth is another, and then just having a good environment for people to be in, and you mentioned mental health and how, and I was saying it's really hand in hand with this. People want to be in an environment where they can be accepted, their words can be accepted, and they don't feel like they're going to be shut down whenever they speak or at times. And so that's, it just creates an environment that people flourish in.
Well, let's go from team to the families. What changes in family dynamics when there is psychological safety and when there's not, when that is missing.
Yeah. And there hasn't been as much work done on this. A lot of the psychological safety research is around teams, but I would give my thoughts, and I think there's direct crossover. And the reason is, that it's like families. It's not exactly the same, but teams, especially smaller teams, are like families. How you treat each other, how you speak to each other affects the way that the family is. And so there's a lot of crossover. It's interesting. I have this coaching course that I run it across South Asia with some of my coworkers. And we did a piece of research. I think we ran it with about 700 people. We did a piece of research on what effect did it have. And, in this coaching course, we talk about active listening, how to really listen well to people, which is, actually part of psychological safety too. If you're really listening well to people, asking really great questions, how do we ask good, open, powerful questions to each other? That type of coaching mentality. And we thought we would teach these skills to leaders, and was well accepted. But what we found, we did it in the team context, we did it in the organizational context, but for so many, when we did this research, they said the biggest thing that changed in my life was I am a better listener to my wife. I am a better listener to my husband. I ask my kids better questions, which engages them more. So actually, we thought, this would help them as leaders. Now, it did in one extent, but in another extent, it was actually helping them much more in their family life and with their spouses and with their children. And so I realized there's a lot of crossover and a lot of this stuff that we help people in and facilitate. It moves into the family. And so psychological safety in the context of the family, I would say, imagine where you're, with my daughters, I have 3 daughters, they're coming to me, and whenever they make a mistake, I say, why did you do that? Like, just don't do that mistake again. You should not be making those mistakes. Okay, that's, if I said that generally to my daughters, that was my attitude. Versus, my daughter comes, she says, I've done this. Let's say actually, we got our kids' report cards yesterday, and she didn't do well in one of the subjects, and I say to her, Gia, you just got to do better. You can't do this. Like, why aren't you doing better? What's your problem? Like, just work harder. Versus, so there's that. Versus, Gia, uh, what's happened here? Is there something that's changed? Can I help you on something? Uh, so you notice the last phrase I used was a question. And so, and it had to do with me, right? It's, can I help you on something? Is there anything I can do to help here? Shared responsibility. And so that piece in the family where you're asking questions rather than telling people, speaking, and often it's negative, and it's a mixed bag, Vikram. Like it's not always black and white. And it's hard, sometimes I think, I mean, am I shaming this, my daughter in this way, or is it not? And so that's, something we have to use great discernment on. But there can be a shift to am I motivating her again through shame, or am I motivating her through, I think you can do this. What can we work on together? I'm going to help you in this. And that, I think, is a shift, is how am I seeing my motivation when something goes wrong? So when mistakes are made, number one, and that's very common because you're trying to discipline your kids, and you need to discipline your kids. That's one of the reasons you're there. It's an important factor of you being a parent is discipline. And so my question is, though, how are we disciplining them? Are we using just fear? Are we using some type of appreciation and encouragement? Of course, appreciation and encouragement is a motivating factor. It's a very good motivating factor. It's not as effective as fear, which is why we use fear so generally, but it is still a motivating factor, appreciating people. In fact, I often ask people in the context of teams, I'll say, is anyone here overappreciated? 99.9% of the time, no one's going to say they're overappreciated. Are you overappreciated, Vikram?
Under.
Are you underappreciated? Yeah. I would say most people say that they feel underappreciated. And so I think all of us could do with a little bit more appreciation.
Absolutely.
And so I think that carries over to the family context. It carries over to, and so it's thinking through, again, not just kids. And then the openness piece. Are we allowing each other to speak openly and grow? Are you allowing your kids to speak into your life and say, hey, Dad, like I saw you do this. Is this right? Are they just able to speak freely with you? That's another, thought for us as parents. I think one of my goals, Vikram, when it comes to raising my 3 daughters is I'd love it for them to get to a time, especially when they leave the house, where they say, I really trust my dad and I can be completely open with him. And I think that's a good aim. One of the good aims as a parent to say, how do I create that trusting relationship where they can be, am I open with them? Are they open with me? Of course, so much of it is modeled. And so we have to be, more vulnerable as parents. But to get to that stage, I think it's a very important thing to get to a place where we can, so I think it has to do with trust. And again, that goes back to teams with high psychological safety are teams that trust each other.
How can we teach that to our families? Because what I've observed, growing up in India and now spending a decade abroad, coming back and seeing, we are at that age. You've got 3 daughters, we've got 3 sons, and my younger brother has 2 sons, and how they are treated. And you're talking about the openness and all, to have that, freedom to express, or that environment, psychological safety environment to express freely. I don't see that very often in our context in India, or I don't know about other Asian countries. There's a lot of fear. It's always one down, top-down communication. Yes. So what we tell you, it's about telling, and not exactly that shared responsibility, how you responded. Okay, is there something I can do, to help? How can that change?
Not easy, because you're talking about changing pieces of culture.
Right.
But I think it comes back to, the fingers pointing at me, the fingers pointing at my family, and you're thinking, okay, I want a psychologically safe family. I want a trusting environment. Am I allowing room for people to critique? even critique myself for my kids to explore avenues. So and so much of the time as parents, we want to say, you should do this, you should go this way. And rather than that, is to say, here are the options, let's explore it together.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying every avenue is good, but giving options rather than dictating one way. And so I think that type of where there is this openness, and to say we can look. And I think, trying new things, growing in new skills, where it's not just the standard, and so often, we live in this hyper academic country, in the sense that, so much is keyed towards how you perform in your exams. And so moving past that and saying growth is much more than just how you're going to do in your exams. It's learning new skills. It's being able to think in new ways, in different ways, analytically, creatively. And how do we help? And then encouraging, our children to explore these avenues and not holding them back. Yeah, go ahead.
Theoretically, we know that, right? We know that we should do all these things, and these are beneficial, giving room to children to speak up, to speak their mind, express themselves, to listen, goes back to listen. These days, parents don't have all that time to listen. Firstly, it's not a practice at home. Secondly, to listen, you talked about active listening, asking great questions. They don't sit down. They don't give any time with children, unless you are educated and aware and you know the benefits. Somebody who's like you, who is in this field and who knows the benefit and how important it is, and some other people who had reached or gained that knowledge of awareness, how it impacts the children. But here, like you said, we're so ambition driven. They think they want to pour everything, sending them to the best school and pouring money. After that, if they need extra help, no, it's not it. Can I help? No, Jonathan is not helping, or Vikram. No, can I help? No. They say, okay, let's get the coaching center or the tuition teacher to do the rest, right? And for me, at this point, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's work going on, but for me, it seems a very utopian, utopian idea.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned something very interesting at the beginning. You said, we don't have time, we don't have time to listen. Now, I would challenge that. I would say, I think we do have time. I think we don't have time because we have all these other priorities, whatever it is. But actually, I want to prioritize my family first. I want to prioritize, how my wife and daughter, that's my closest environment that I have to protect. And so I do have time for them. I want to make time for them. And so I would say, and now I'm not saying we're sitting down for 2 hours a day just saying, what are your thoughts? That's not what I'm saying. I'm simply saying, I think we have time to listen to our kids, but it comes with trust. And so it doesn't just mean me asking questions and saying, I'm listening to you. It comes out of a relationship. And so it's not simply transactional. I think we have to really work at, and that trust is built by being vulnerable. And there's a great book called the Trusted Advisor. In that book, the authors have a trust equation. In that trust equation, they have several factors. One of them, and actually this is the underlying factor they talk about, is that are you for the other person? In other words, do you really care for the other person? Someone can tell, does Jonathan really care for me? Sort of underlyingly, is he just speaking, words for the sake of it? And so that, where you're actually for, and you say, I really want to listen to genuinely, and I genuinely want to have a relationship, that piece builds trust. There are other factors too, but that's a big piece, right? Do I really care? Do I show that care? How am I showing that care? Those types of factors are big when it comes to developing that relationship. And then out of that relationship, if you're able to trust, if you're able to be open, high psychological safety, again, thriving in many different factors.
I think so. Parents are still using corporal punishment, where they're beating the children, let alone listening to them. They're like, one thing is top down, instructing them, reprimanding them, but also at times smacking them.
Yeah.
You know, they use this thing in our Christian world, the proverb, you know, spare the rod and spoil the child.
Yeah.
We've heard that. Still being used. I hear it around me.
Yeah.
I think I still see quite a distance getting to that awareness. I mean, here we're talking about all the things of building trust, you know, that it should be there, but I still see it. Do you see that we can come to a place, or how long will it take? How much work? Because it's so entrenched in our cultural identity and, you know, thinking, way of thinking, and mindset.
And specifically corporal punishment you're talking about. Yeah. It's you know, there's different forms of discipline. I'm in the, you know, the different spheres when it comes to how do we discipline kids. And like I said initially, it's an important factor of parenting, right? Now, I would be against using corporal discipline for just flat, you know, so that this is how we do it. I would be, you know, I would be open to saying, you know, why, especially for a smaller child, you know, let's say 1.5 to 3. And I've had to think about this quite a lot, one in my own parenting, and we talk about it a lot in our family, you know, life, and with my siblings, is to when do we use this, you know. So you know, the interesting part in corporal punishment is in that time between, let's say, 1 and about 3.5, 4, is does pain speak better than words because the language isn't fully developed, you know. And so I would say it's quite nuanced, you know, this when it comes to that. Number one, I would say we should never ever ever punish out of anger, out of high emotion, you know, and especially when it comes to corporal punishment. I would say there are, you know, I'm in that, you know, field where I'm like, you know, there is, when it comes to smaller kids, you know, and I'm not saying beating your kids, I'm not a proponent of that, but at some point, is there you know, where pain actually is a motivator, physical pain, and maybe it's a flick or a tap or whatever it is. You know, I'm in that area again. Then I would cross over and I would say, okay, 4.5, 5. The child can speak, can understand. In that area, okay, when it comes to that field, okay, then you're saying, okay, you can use words now. You can, and there's more cognitive ability. You can use reason. In that area, I would say, okay, now I think there needs to be a movement. Now, when it comes to discipline, I would say some discipline works for these types of kids, some discipline works for these type of kids. And that's where we have to be discerning. But this high emotive anger, which is often, and I think when people talk about corporal punishment, they mean you're hitting a kid out of anger. I think that's what most people think. And so I'd say, yeah, I'm against that, you know, completely. I would say we have to really be discerning in the discipline we use and see what works. But belittling and making people fear a lot, it has a long-term effect. We know that. And so I would say be very wary of that type of discipline. I mean, you're talking about schools. I think many schools in our context don't allow it, even though it may be practiced. So there has been a little bit of a evolving in the way that discipline happens. But I think there still needs to be ongoing conversation as to what works and what are the long-term effects.
Let's talk about the long-term effects. What are the long-term effects it can have on children? Let's say
Corporal punishment?
Yeah, because of corporal punishment.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know all the research. I don't speak into that much.
Right.
But we know it has an effect. You know, we know it does have a long-term effect. I don't know exactly what the research shows, and it's probably varying too.
Right.
You know, what I would push from a psychological safety perspective, you know, since we're on that area, is okay, if I'm using corporal punishment, what effect is it having on the child, and what can I see? And I think we need to be very, very careful with it, because it can have a deep effect. And again, it is, I guess it is in many ways a form of fear. If you're creating that physical fear, and that has an effect. And so I would put the onus on the practitioner, and just say, let's think through this. What are some better ways of motivation we can use for our kids? And again, I think it's mixed. I don't think there's one size fits all, but I would certainly promote looking at different methods that could be more effective.
Does that work with adults as well, that fear works better than motivation?
No, well, like I said initially, fear works better than as a motivating form, but the long-term effects are, if you have a boss who is constantly telling you, if you don't do this, just see what's going to happen to you. You are, expendable here in this organization. Finish this, by tomorrow, or what's going to happen to you. It is constantly like that. That environment is horrible to be in. I mean, I know these bosses, I've worked with many of them, and a lot of people tell me about their bosses and say, this is how they are. These are the things they say. And, that type of effect, a lot of these people, I met a guy in an organization, and he said, this year, I have been to 600 temples, and I'm not joking. Like literally, he'd been to some 2 a day type. And he said, I am looking for peace in my life because my boss has driven me crazy with the demands and the threats and all that's going on. And it was a pretty secure position for him, but he said the effects, and you could see physically what it had done to him, that environment. And so had it motivated, he said, I get my work done. But the effects on him, if he finds a way out of that environment, he will go. He wanted to leave. And so, it has an effect in the short term. It's motivating in the short term, but long-term motivation, you're probably going to lose these people if they have a chance to go.
What happens what happens to these kind of people? Like you just cited the example of, who went to 600 temples and all.
Yeah.
Where do they turn to? Do they always, like, not everybody goes to temple is religious? Like, is there some way they can turn in the corporations? And you worked in corporations, big companies, and leadership organizations. Where do they go? Is there awareness of this term, psychological safety, and people they can turn to?
I don't think there's a huge awareness of it. At least the organizations I've been with, it's becoming more prominent in many organizations. To the question, where do they turn to? I think they often go to their colleagues in our context.
Okay.
They're just talking amongst themselves, and that's really their counseling, because a lot of other colleagues are going through it.
Right.
And so I think that's it. I mean, I actually followed up with this particular man, and I think he did leave that team pretty soon after that. And so if they find, like I said, if they find another opportunity, they're usually getting out and they're turning to their colleagues for some type of solace of those who are experiencing the same thing. But it may not be a boss too, right?
Yeah,
it may just be someone you're working with.
Yeah.
And that's why they say, when you have even a colleague who is, low psychological safety, constantly putting you down, that's hard too.
Yeah.
And so I think, all types of things people go to, but I would say in our context, South Asia, people have a safe environment often in their family. And as far as a sounding board, somewhere they can be open. And so that's often another place they'll go, to just speak about it. And that in itself has some counseling, effect on people.
Can a person who is not in a position of authority sort of introduce psychological safety or take the initiative to bring that awareness in the team or that work environment?
Yeah. I think that depends on the context of the team. I think they can. It will depend on if the boss is open or not, if they're open to that, or the colleagues. It often starts with a discussion. A discussion as to how can we speak to each other with respect? How can we speak to each other in a way that is positive, in a way that is uplifting? I would say that's a good way to start. And usually we can do that as colleagues. May not be so much up the chain, but at least across your colleagues. And I think that's a good place to start if you're talking about someone who's sort of middle level in an organization or just at the bottom.
There's another thing. People feel the most unsafe with the people closest to them.
Yeah.
Why is that? Why do people feel unsafe among the people closest to them? And I mean, we don't want to go in that direction about abuse and all that happens in family, but just in that safe environment, often it is like, in the family, close friends, maybe neighbors.
First, it's quite sad, isn't it?
Yeah, it is very sad.
The people closest to you, you don't feel like you can be open to.
Yeah.
I mean, I like you said, it's a reality. I don't know if it is most of the time. I think people usually do have either close family who they can be open with, or friendships that they can be open. But like you say, there is often that where you don't. And I think it comes down to the psychological safety, is that they've been put down, they've been chastised, they've been, they've gone through something, some deep hurt, often, where that trust is gone, and it's hard in the context of, in a close relationship. When you break trust, that's really difficult, because this should be your most trusting relationship, right? And so if you can't speak freely, openly, and just be yourself, that, it's a struggle. And I think we have to see in our relationships, my spouse, my partner, my kids, am I someone who they can be completely honest with? It's a good question to ask them. It's a good question to ask those people close to you, because ultimately it's much harder to change someone else than it is to change myself. And so I think we have to be, again, pointing the fingers towards ourselves and saying, am I that safe person? Now, it's interesting. I was at, I won't say the organization, but a big global organization. I was working with their directors, and I asked them this question. It's a very simple question. I said, at this stage of life, they're mostly in their 60s and 70s, country directors. I said, at this stage of life, what's most important to you? And interestingly, in the room, there's maybe 10 of them, country directors. Probably about 5 or 6 of them said the same thing. They said, a relationship where I can be myself and not be judged and just be free. And I think a lot of us are longing for that. And that's where it goes back to psychological safety. Psychological safety is, are we having those environments in our families? Why is it that these directors who, look to be quite established in life are saying that I just want to be myself? I don't want to put up a facade. I don't want to just try and be someone I'm not, these relationships. And that's the difficulty often in leadership too, is that you're not, there's all this expectation, that we put on people. And if people don't live up to our expectations, we sort of, push them out a bit, at least in our relationships. And so to be safe and to promote that safety, and I think actually it's easier to talk about it as safety, right? We just say, am I safe? Am I safe can people be confidential with me? Can they be themselves with me? Or do they feel like they, the way they speak to, when it comes to Johnny, have to speak a certain way? And so those factors, I think, are so key in our personal relationships too. That flows out into other relationships.
Is it also the way, recently I heard somebody say, I think I'm too nice. The way I talk to him, he doesn't treat that person, treat everybody the way he talks to me, sometimes does it depend on you as well, how you're treated or shut down?
Yeah, it goes both ways.
And do you change your character or the way you are? If you're nice, you can't become a bad person or, really rude or behave in a certain way, because then you're being impacted by that other person's bad behavior.
Yeah, and I think we have to make a difference here between, and this is actually one of the mistakes people make, is when this is, okay, psychological safety, let's say in a team environment, you're just asking me to be nice to everybody. And that's not the case, right? It's not just being nice, right? It's not saying you don't hold people to a standard, you don't hold people to high accountability. It's those things are there. You hold people to a standard, but how you do it, how you motivate people towards that standard, towards that accountability, makes a difference.
Right.
And so it's not simply, oh, I'm a nice guy, people can speak to me, and so it's not just the question of being nice. It's a question of being safe. And I think those are very different aspects of how we relate to people.
Okay, let's talk about some of the phrases you did mention earlier. Let's talk about some of the phrases that that we speak and shut down people without even realizing it.
Yeah. And, like I said, it's more common than we think.
Yep.
I was on a balcony some time ago, and I was having a cup of tea, and I heard a husband and wife arguing with each other just on the bottom of the balcony. And, I was going in, didn't want to be, impede on their privacy too much. But as I was going in, listening to this conversation, they were shouting at each other. The wife says, "You never do this," The husband says, "You never do this," that type of language where you speak to people in definitives, and you're always like this, and you're never like this. That's very common in,
Right.
especially close relationships. Right. I think that's language that doesn't make people feel safe. I feel when you direct threats, when you say, if you don't come on time, you'll see what happens to you, right? Let's see what happens. That's a direct threat.
Right. Yeah.
And those types of things, subtle things, where you say, can't believe you said that, and so you're saying, sort of shame, but it's not as direct, right? That type of speech.
Or like you just mentioned, you don't know that.
You don't know that, right? You didn't know that, the way that we say, and there are there's a whole list of those types of things, right? In relationships. I would say also, we have a tendency, in conflict management, we say, separate the person and the problem.
Okay.
And we have a tendency to put those two together. You are the problem. She is, a late person. She's just, rather than, maybe there's something behind this, or the reason she's late. Maybe she has to pick up her kids from school, and she's, there's all types of things going on.
Right.
There's just issues she can't figure out. And so separating those two, right? They are not the problem. They may have a problem, and so that separation is very important.
Okay.
And then sort of direct phrases, naming people. It's so common in politics, unfortunately, right? Saying things about people. I would say it extends to even how we speak about people behind their back. And this is something I'm really trying to work on, right? Is because word carries through, and even subtle language carries through, right? In relationships.
Yeah.
And so if I talk about this man here to you and say, this guy is just so annoying, that's affected the way that you see him, right? And, as I'm talking about him, and that has changed this dynamic, the relationship here. Yeah. You're seeing him in a certain way, and I'm almost coming, maybe if I've had a conflict with him, and I'm almost, trying to defend myself, and this guy is just, the way he just says, he speaks is just, he's so rude, and I'm talking about him directly to you, and you're his colleague too, and you maybe even his friend,
Right.
right? How we talk to each other,
Right.
and so we have to be careful. And
how does that perceive, if you're talking, let's say, about a third person to, let's say, to me, how me, let's say, or another person perceive you, who you're telling that to?
Yeah. Well, I think it does affect, right? I think it has a direct effect with the way that we perceive each other. And especially that type of negative comment, I would say we had to be careful with it. We need people who can be open to, who can be sounding boards for us. That's important. We want to be open. But, we have to be aware of those relationships, the factors that are there. And so cognizant of just how are these people
What is
connected?
a healthy way to talk about a third person? Let's say you've really had a conflict and you just want to let it out. You had a disagreement, or let's say even an argument.
Yeah.
And in that context, it's just not gossiping. You just recently had something you want to share it with somebody.
Yeah. And so that somebody, right? You be careful who is that somebody you're sharing with it, because one that can go around the organization very easily. And I'm talking about organizations because the context I know, right, of organizations. You should have someone who's not related that you should be able to talk freely to. So I would be a proponent of having someone, and maybe it's your spouse, maybe it's someone else outside of the organization who you can talk freely. Be careful as to who you talk to in the context of a team and an organization negatively about. That has many other ramifications. I see this, I see people on the same team, working together, but not talking to each other, at least in a personal way, because something has happened and that has affected this, and that even the way they sit to each other, and if you're in a room with them, and this is so common. And so I think we should have someone who is actually outside of the situation to talk to and be open with. I say we need someone like that. Someone who is a confidant. And actually, that's a question for us is, and it has to do with psychological safety. When someone says to us something negative about that person there, right? And, you may agree with it too. It can stop there. It can stop with you, or you can multiply it. And so am I confident in the way that, am I that confident in someone is confidential and keeping that confidence of what that person has shared, or am I someone who tells others? And I've heard this in so many organizations, and it's almost, it's very simple, right? You want to be someone who's confidential. I think all of us do. But at the same time, I have that nugget of gossip, of information about something, and that gives me a certain power. And so the ability to stop that and say, I'm not going to use this for my benefit, for my power, to maybe up me in the organization because I have that knowledge, that takes courage.
Let's talk about, you said sometimes people, don't talk to each other, and, what it creates if the word goes around and somebody says, okay, he said that about me, and she said that about me. And let's say there's a situation where colleagues are not talking to each other. Is it unsafe? Like if they're going about and there's no communication, when there's gap in communication, what does that do to psychological safe environment?
Yeah, and that goes into the conflict realm, right? The conflict resolution, which there is a connection there between, if let's say there's been a conflict and two people are not talking, that environment then it gets a little bit more tense, right? And it's really hard when you have to work closely together.
Obviously.
And so if these two guys aren't able to talk freely, or they talk, and often that comes with talking a little bit behind each other's back. That is not safe, right? For them, they don't feel that safety. Their safety has gone down. the others then, so okay, how does this, you're trying to figure out, how does this dynamic work? Can I talk to him about this? Can I not talk to him about this? Will he get offended? When I say, if I talk to him about that person,
Right.
so I would say it lowers psychological safety.
Okay.
That's why we have to move for openness and resolution, and I would say forgiveness. And I think forgiveness is a big piece in actually resolving conflicts on a number of levels. But as I've gone around, I see people, I worked with this organization, and they said the number one thing in our organization, negative point, they said, is people hold grudges.
Okay.
And they said something happened, and someone said something to me, and I just, and I will subtly, and usually we call it, passive revenge. I will subtly, I will not either be silent when they're speaking, or not talk to them, or not look at them, that type of passive revenge, which is, all over, silent treatment, and it may not be directly, I may not even be, I'm speaking about them, but it's my actions and how I speak or not speak.
Right.
And, that type of passive revenge is very common. And this organization said people hold grudges for years, right?
Wow.
And they're on the same team. And so they, that, if you think of that environment, that doesn't lead to great innovation. It doesn't lead to great growth. It leads to people stepping on eggshells all around, right? And saying, they're getting their work done, and that's the interesting thing I find is people can live for years in these environments where they're getting their work done, but is there real growth happening? Is there real sort of creativity and innovation? People can be open. Well, no, these conflicts has happened. And so, it's not easy. I mean, conflict, we can talk about conflict till the cows come home, and resolution and forgiveness. It's not an easy thing because people are really deeply hurt often. And it's really, especially when it's someone close to them. And so there needs to be that openness, and I think, again, fingers pointing at me. Am I willing to forgive, and am I willing to let go?
How do you sort of work in this environment, like you talked about, where there's a conflict? How do you work with these people to bring them together to a place of where they can be in harmony and start communication again?
It's not easy. You have to, what I would promote is candid conversations, and creating a space, creating a place where people can be open. I heard a quote, it's an interesting quote by a psychologist who said, it's hard to be at enmity with someone when you know their story. It's hard to be at enmity with someone when you know their story. I would agree with that. Some people would say it's impossible. I don't know if I agree with that, but I think when you know where someone's coming from, and you really listen to them, and you hear their perspective, it is harder to be at enmity with them. And so we, an environment, or creating a space where people can talk candidly, openly, and share without being interrupted or put down or defended. And so that type of conversation, I would say. So I'd say as leaders, we have to create that space to be able to, if people are in conflict, if I'm in conflict with someone, am I able to talk openly? It doesn't always go both ways. And this is the difficult thing, Vikram. Like, again, in conflict, what I've realized is it's easy to talk about these things. It's easy to say, let's hear each other's story.
Right.
But people are deeply hurt, and it takes time often to heal. And so to be in a space where we can, and to take time, but to move towards a space where we can be open with each other. We don't always know how the response will be, right, when we're completely open. And then I think that's what holds us back.
Yeah.
And maybe that person will become more antagonistic. We don't know. We can't necessarily. We can only create that space and environment for that to happen.
Right.
And so it's not foolproof. It doesn't always happen, and sometimes it's very sad to see, what these broken relationships has done, even in an organization. But we can certainly move towards that. And I think that's the hope.
Right. it requires empathy as well. When you said about starting candid conversations, being empathetic, seeking to understand before you want to be understood.
Yeah, and I mean, in conflict, we often say, can I rephrase or even just spell out the perspective of the other person in the conflict or the group or whoever it is? That's, I think, a key piece to resolution, is to be able to first have the awareness and understand their perspectives. It's empathy, and that should be something we at least are able to move towards for a certain harmony and flourishing in teams. Is what is their perspective? Am I not seeing something? Trying to hear their perspective, certainly. That brings people together. What doesn't bring people together is when we're just silent about it and we think over time this will
resolve.
So naturally resolve. And now maybe if you're able to have a good relationship with the person and continue to be open, maybe that issue is on the side, but you're able to, that could resolve in that you can sort of build up trust again in a relationship. But that issue may still be there. I would say better to be a little bit open, to be saying, is there a time when I can come and talk about this? Now, it may take time.
Right.
I don't think everything has to be resolved immediately, but to have that space and to move towards that space where we can be open about things.
So what you're saying is people can come together, two people can come together before resolving something, and build trust first, and then look for an opportunity where they can talk about this.
I would be an advocate of that, where because people find it, that issue, that conflict may be holding them back.
Right.
From really moving forward in the relationship. So you sort of put that onto the back burner or in the fridge, wherever you want to put it, for a while. And just say, let's wait on that. But I can have a relationship with this person. I can still care for this person. I still appreciate them. That's one of the activities you can do when you're in conflict with someone, is, just write down, what do I appreciate about this person? What are the things I'm thankful for about them? Especially people who are close. And what do I love about them?
Right.
That switches the mindset, from critique to appreciation. It's a different mindset. And so that can help in the relationships.
So there's one situation where both people know that there's something, in between them, there's lack of communication, where they see the problem, or it might be an obvious thing, conflict, that they went apart. Then there are places where it just drifts apart, and one person might hold a grudge for someone else where the other person is not even aware of. It happened to me. I had a good friend of mine, and for some time we were very close, and we were spending time regularly, meeting each other. And when I moved away, because, I went to a different country and I was moving around, so I was not very often, seeing this person. And one time I saw them after a while, after a long time. And the first thing that they greet me, and this was in a social setting, I come back and he was there with his family, and he said, "We forgive you." Before greeting, they said, "We forgive you." And I was taken aback, because they publicly said, okay, whatever. But I was also clueless. Like, okay, this person was offended. There was something going on.
You didn't know it.
He was holding something that I never knew about,
You had no awareness of it at all.
No awareness of it. And so what you said also, so often, it could have been something I said, something I did. And I went back and I discussed, what was the thing I'm trying to decipher.
Right?
And I have no idea till today, where did I go wrong? The only assumptions, okay, it could be this. Did he get offended because of this or that or that? And that is very tricky, because when you cause pain or hurt to somebody and you don't even realize it, I think so that's the worst thing.
And I think we all do it, Vikram. Unwittingly, we do cause hurt to people by things we've said. We, just don't know. We've sort of offended them, and that happens. And because of that, I would push for more open environments where we can share. And again, it's for us. It's like, can someone share with me really how they feel, how they felt about me saying that? Am I someone that they can share, and I'm not just biting their head off as a response to that? again, also the other side of that, Vikram, it's interesting. There's a wonderful book by R.T. Kendall. It's called Total Forgiveness. And he talks about, and it's a Christian perspective. He talks about what does real forgiveness look like? What does total forgiveness look like? One of the things he says in that book, and I've thought about this a lot in the context of conflict, is he says, don't do that. Don't do it where they don't know the issue and you go up to them and say, I forgive you, and because he said that does not help. It's not a good way of moving forward, because one, they don't know the issue. Two, they may have moved on from it, and so it's that they're at a completely different place than you. And the proponent, what he's a proponent of for forgiveness is, he says, just forgive, like completely, like let it go.
You don't have to speak it out to the person, right?
Forgive in your heart. Forgive, and so you are saying, what is forgiveness? You're saying, I'm not going to bring this up again. Because if you're bringing it up, have you really forgiven? Right? If you keep on bringing it up, because if I keep on bringing it up, I'm still trying to justify my point. If I talk to him about, Vikram said this, I'm still saying, I was right and Vikram was wrong, and so, I stop talking about it. If you've really forgiven, then you don't keep on bringing it up. This is the point of this book. And it's saying, and you don't, and it's saying, I'm refusing, even when it comes up, I am releasing it again. And this is what's so hard about forgiveness, right? This is what's so hard about letting it go, is because, it does come up there. I don't have a delete button in my head where it's like, plonk, and I've forgotten about it.
Why is it so hard to forgive?
I think that's it, right? Is that we can't just, delete
erase the memory, the hurt.
Memory, right?
Yeah.
Is that, and so it comes up and we're hurt. And I don't negate the fact that people are really genuinely hurt, and that forgiveness is something that is easy. I don't want to say that, when we can be very flippant about that when talking about conflicts, and we can say, oh yeah, just forgive him, or, why haven't you forgiven yet? Again, that's not psychologically safe, a good question is, what would it take, to forgive that person? But moving towards it, it's a journey, and it's a long journey. One of my definitions of marriage is just ongoing forgiveness.
Okay.
We just need to get, because we're constantly hurting each other and offending each other. We just need to keep on forgiving each other. We learn to forgive each other in the closest relationship that we have. And so I think that, but it is hard. I don't think we should say this is something that, that we just do. It's a journey, but it is that process of saying, I'm not going to talk about this. Whenever it comes up, I'm going to release it. There's something, though, when you're able to forgive, Vikram, and you're able to release, and let go. That is freeing. It's powerful. It's something that can, give us a whole new life, because people hold on, right? It's like a noose around your neck, and they may have moved on, like you said.
Right.
You may have moved on, and this person is thinking about this, every day, and and who is it affecting? It's affecting him, ultimately. Yeah, and so even him saying that, it's interesting that he said, I forgive you, but he didn't tell you what it was for, too. Maybe you didn't ask.
No, I never asked.
Yeah. And that would be, maybe asking and talking about it. And I don't know the context of that, that with your relationship. So maybe it was hard.
Thing was, when it's in a public thing, it's not even, you just come and sit down and you're just thinking, what was it for? And then you never bring it up because it becomes awkward, and you said, okay, let it be whatever it was. And like you said, I never brought it up. We had an okay relationship after that.
Okay, so you did have a relationship.
Yeah. It was not like, from my side, was nothing. And him saying and speaking it out, I said, okay, I receive it. I took it with that attitude.
Yes.
All right, my behavior and attitude towards you is not going to change. I'll be the same person, and we're going to hang out. So, whenever I come to this town, I'm going to see you, reach out, and we'll spend time together.
Yeah.
Never bring it up.
Yeah.
I don't want to know. I'm sorry. And it was kind of thing, inner acceptance as well.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry. After I heard that he forgave me,
Yes.
I'm sorry, between me and my conscience and God, if I hurt somebody, all right,
Yes.
let go. You know, because for him, it was over by speaking it out.
Okay, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because when somebody speaks out, okay, I forgive you, it's over.
Yeah.
Publicly declaring, you know?
Yeah.
And so I just accepted that, even though it lingered a while in my mind, just out of curiosity.
Yeah. Yeah. And it also doesn't help you necessarily not make the same mistake again, right? It's not really helping you.
Oh, yeah. I have become just that thing and one or two other things where people have been offended. For example, there was a person, and this was not a very close friend, but in Germany, I met somebody and I visited this person, built a new studio, and I spent some time. It was work related, and we talked something, you know, like we talked, hey, you do script writing, I'm getting into this, and I want to do films. And I said, yeah, great, and all. But that kind of talk, it's not commitment. I didn't say, Jonathan, okay, you know, if you have an idea, I'm going to be the producer, I'm going to invest so much, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. So, but with this person, I don't know, sometimes it's expectations also, which you never understand. And after a while, one day I wrote to him asking, hey, Joe, how you doing and all that. And he said, I don't, and I told a few things. I'm whatever I was at, you know, I'm not interested to know where you are at, what you're doing. Please stop writing to me. And I was again, man, what did I do?
Yes.
And then again, I went back. Did I promise something? Did I promise, okay, I'm going to do a project with you, or we are going to work something? Because he was in a similar kind of media music industry, and I had visited him and his studio and all of that. So things can, and so I became very aware. And how I talk to people, whether I'm giving them expectation, that's what I checked, you know. Not to give anybody expectation. I talk with my wife as well. You know, I have to be very, because the kind of person I'm very encouraging.
Yeah.
So if I go to something, this thing I checked about me, I said, man, that's a great, wow, you did a great job. And this, you know, you could record great artists here, make music, and this is gonna flourish. Just speaking like positive things. And sometimes it doesn't go well. Sometimes it might show, hey, this guy is so interested that he's going to partner with me. Perhaps.
Yes.
You know, that kind of thing.
Yeah. And that is hard. I mean, you talk also about reading people, right? I mean, it's really hard to read that relationship and think, you know, and again, like I said, I think we're hurting and offending people much more than we think. At the same time, I think people are letting things go more than we think, but some people are holding on to it, right? And that's why, you know, high psychological safety, I allowing people to be open, and I just letting go of things, you know, I'm not holding grudges, where people can speak freely, where I'm not. Now, you know, just going back to forgiveness, I don't think that forgiving someone is saying, I'm going to trust them the same. Like, I don't think when I forgiven someone completely, and I said total forgiveness, and that it means my trust is the same as it was before, right? I think those are two different, and I think people maybe don't differentiate that, the difference between, you know, going back into that high trust relationship versus I've let it go, you know? And so I would say those are two opposite pieces that we have to be aware of in relationships. Now, for example, I steal 5,000 rupees from you. You know, after a while, I become guilty. I tell you I've spent it, but I'll pay it back to you. You know, don't worry. Now you say, oh, you know, you shouldn't have done that. I forgive you though, you know. Now our relationship has been affected. You may forgive me. You may not bring it up again. You've sort of released it for yourself. But you're not going to leave your money around with me, you know, again, right? That would take time to build up. You know, that type of trust would take time. Now, there's a very, you know, simple example, but that would take time to build up. You may have forgiven me, but you may not trust me in the same way. And as a result of that, my relationship may not be to the same extent as it was before. Doesn't mean we can't have a relationship, But I would say again, trust can be built up, but it's not, doesn't just come again overnight,
Happens a lot in marriages as well,
Yeah.
when there's one partner cheats.
Yeah. Unfaithfulness.
And they
Yeah.
can unfaithfulness.
Yeah.
And you can forgive, but then again, that trust. Okay, so forgiveness can happen, but trust needs time to build up again.
Absolutely.
And maybe it's never the same again.
Exactly. And so I think it would be too utopian to say you forgive and the relationship goes back to where it was. But I would promote forgiving and moving towards relationships that are trusting, so looking to build trust up again. Not easy, because people, we're really hurt by things. And so, again, this is something that we have to be very conscious about, and really hard in relationships. And I'm just thinking about some of my own personal relationships, to build that type of relationship I had before, and you have to really make an effort, and so that's really difficult.
Apart from like saying such harmful words, are there other ways you can actually cause damage to safe psychological environment?
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of like that, what I talked about, passive revenge.
Yeah.
And I think that's happening on a micro level in teams a lot. People do it in many ways. It's interesting. People do it in even email addresses. They'll copy people in to or even blind copy people in. Although that's less, something that happens. But copying people into emails where you have something and you say, do this way. You didn't do it this way. So you're sort of reprimanding them, and you've copied one, maybe two people in, or even blind copied people in. That's a form of getting at people, and it's not open, right? I mean, the big thing in leadership, they say critique in private, praise in public.
Yeah.
Easy to say again, but that critique in private is a high psychological idea.
Okay.
Right? Is that we are, it's not, we're not shaming people. Think of the punishment in schools, right?
Yeah.
It's all in public, right? It's like, it's hey, little Johnny, you go here into the corner, you hold your ears, you do this, how dare you do this? Why did you think your parents would be happy with you doing that? In front of everybody.
Right.
Low psychological safety.
Yeah.
And we do it in subtle ways, like I said, CC in people in. Maybe we'll say something to someone with a few people there, and it's something that's a little bit sort of backhanded. A comment that we might say. Maybe it's sarcastic too. Sarcasm is one of the ways that we use. Oh yeah, you've done it that way. Oh really? Okay. That type of thing. That can change the environment a bit.
Yeah. Do you think sarcasm is kind of, some people even call it passive aggression? Is it? Or
it's hard. I mean, it depends on the context. So I wouldn't just make a big sweep,
a blanket statement.
Right. Just say sarcasm is like that. We have to be careful with it. In teams. People use it as humor all the time. And so I use it in the context of humor. You have to be careful of how you use it in humor, and so we just want to be careful with it. That would be my thought.
When I was living in Germany, I traveled to Belgium, and I met a guy from I don't know, England or Ireland. And so he said, Vikram, where are you flying in from? I said, from Germany. He asked me a question, and he said, where would you be without humor? Where would you be without humor? So I didn't know. I didn't get it. He said, in Deutschland, in Germany. So that was his way of starting. I was like, okay, I'm not a German. I'm an Indian living in Germany. So I didn't take any offense or anything. I was kind of like that. That's his way of humor. So especially in the UK, I've seen, I mean, you've spent many years there. They have this kind of dry humor. So it depends on the context as well. Maybe those guys, when they're talking among themselves and use that kind of dry humor or sarcasm, it's taken better than in a in an American setting, for
Oh,
example.
absolutely. I mean, there's a big cultural piece to it, Vikram.
Right.
And so that's why I wouldn't make a blanket statement as
Right.
do not be sarcastic, because, it can be that people genuinely, it can actually, humor can create higher psychological safety, right?
Oh, yeah.
Is that, when people are laughing together
Right.
and able to have fun and enjoy each other's, together, that is high psychological safety, that you're saying, I'm enjoying this fight. I can be open, I can be, and without being judged,
Exactly.
And so, but humor can also put down, and so that's where we have to make that differentiation.
Yeah.
Yeah, there is a big cultural piece to it. So I know, the British humor, every culture has its own take on the humor. I lived in England for many years. I lived in America for many years, and some things I thought were really funny, in America, would just, fall on, sort of, non-smiling faces where they would, what are you saying? Why are you saying that?
Right.
Or that sort of stupid or dorky, and so it's, there's nuance to humor.
Right.
You have to really understand culture.
Yeah.
But again, with sarcasm, with humor, that's putting people down, and I think that's where we sort of draw the line, right?
Yeah.
Is
Yeah.
something they do here is they will choose someone. I see it actually in, places like restaurants, and they'll choose someone to make fun of a lot, and they become the bunt of people's humor, and so some of it might be, not nothing, right? Some of it might be quite fun, but some of it they'll be like, oh, this, and especially, when the genders are mixed or whatever, they're suddenly teasing this person, and it comes a lot and a lot, and that person becomes the focus of all their teasing. Teasing is a part of, a common part of culture here. That's not safe, when
Okay.
someone is constantly being teased,
Right.
and they may laugh it off, but think what it's doing to them, and so that, I don't think that's necessarily thought about in these contexts much. I don't see that so much in the organizations.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, and I catch myself because I have heard it, but I don't think it's as prominent, but it is certainly part of our culture.
What do you think of teasing in the families where siblings tease each other? Like, we've got 3 boys, they're teasing, coming up with creative names for each other. What do you think of that kind of teasing?
Again, the context is so important. Creative names, you said, right? I suppose it just depends, is it derogatory or not? Is it putting someone down? And so that's where we have to be discerning.
Yeah. And sometimes even we as parents don't understand, like, why did you come up with this name and all?
Yeah.
And I know the older one, so the middle one is pretty outgoing, and he is loud, flamboyant. The old one is more reserved, and so we feel almost like, we have to protect him and all.
Yes.
So we like it when he answers back and he comes up with something that he can say.
Right.
Okay, so we're observing that kind of dynamic, but also we don't know what's going on in our child's mind,
Yeah, and the question for us as parents is, rather, do you stop that type of language, right? Do you say, we don't speak like this here in our family? And I think that's where we have to, again, it goes back to that word discernment, as parents, is this putting people down? And again, the long-term effect where they may laugh it off, they may not think it's affected them, but it really has. And so, intent again.
Intent, yeah.
Are we doing it in a loving manner, or are we doing it in a manner that is actually just getting at someone and put a negative? Yeah.
We talked about some phrases that are harmful, right? That we should avoid. You never do this, or you're always doing this, or saying this. All these kind of phrasings. Are there words that we can use, or phrasings, to actually build up the other person?
Yeah, and it's interesting you say that. When I used to do these psychological safety trainings, we would come up with lists of words we use, and actually, the longer you think about it, the more you come up with. But then I realized, gosh, like, we should actually be also really pushing what words can we use? How can we change that culture of language
Right.
in our organization or family? And so now we have lists. I would say a few things. One is moving from you to we. So when your child has made a mistake and you say, you shouldn't have done that.
Right.
Why did you do that? Moving that to say, how can we change this for next time? So I've joined the ownership now of change, and there is this combined responsibility.
Right.
And it's really saying, I can help you on this. I'm willing to help you at least on this. So I would say, and that you is a little bit condemning, is that you need to do it differently, whereas the we is saying, we're in this together.
Right.
And so that's one of the pieces I would say, and you can do this as as a boss, as a superior in an organization. Someone makes this mistake,
Right.
and you just say, where did we go wrong? What could we do here? Again, the we language, I would say, is one of the ways, and there are lots of ways we can have higher psychological safety. Another piece I would say is having times that we're open to learn from mistakes, and even we open it up for critique. Now, that may be privately, and I would actually say the critique piece should be privately, and also having times where you openly in a group or a team say, let's learn from these mistakes. And it's not to point fingers at anyone. And I think that's where you have to be very careful. But there's so much room to learn from mistakes, failures, things we didn't do right, things that, and I think that's actually, even in our context, South Asia, it's something, because of the shame, it's something we don't talk about as much. I remember when I was living in Delhi a few years ago, I was holding these seminars, and I thought, let me have an open session, and it was, I can't remember what it's called. But it was essentially, it was share your failure and share your learnings from it. And so I invited lots of people. It was an open event, and I called it something about failures, learning from our failures, And what was interesting was I talked to many people, and I said, this is a time. But you only need to share as much as you want to, come and talk about what went wrong. You don't even need to call it a failure. You can say it was just a mistake, something. But I learned from it. That's what we want to know, right? And it was interesting. I think I invited sort of 15 or 20 people to speak, different fields, different spheres. And I think we only had, if I remember correctly, it was 2 or 3 people who spoke for the whole evening. Now, it was fascinating. Like, it was amazing because people were open, and they said, I made this mistake at this time. And many of them were sort of high up, directors of organizations or such. And they just came and shared, these are the mistakes I made. These are the things I did. And it was wonderful, it was a wonderful learning time, and people were really, edified by it. But what I realized was, why is it that people don't want to share it? There's that shame, right?
Yeah.
It's like, I have made these mistakes. I don't want to talk about them.
Right.
Right. Whereas we have to create environments where we're open and we're not judgmental, and we're saying, this is just something wonderful to learn from, these mistakes. And I don't think we do that enough. I don't think most organizations are doing that, because what happens at the end of a month, or every few months, you have an appraisal, and you say, you got to work on this, 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 this. And people generally, you're a little bit shy about the areas that you're not doing so well in, And so to be able to want to share, some mistake you've made, it kind of puts you out there, and you're trying to sort of add value to the organization. But I think that does add value to the organization. And so it's created, and it often has to come from leadership, where you're creating an environment where, and maybe it's anonymous too, maybe it is not talking about names, you don't know who's done it, or it's something what you can sort of lay out in a way that it's not pointing at anybody, but to be able to say, we really learn, and we want to learn from things that went wrong. I think it's a great thing
Yeah.
for safety. It's a great thing for a learning organization to grow as an organization.
What were the mistakes, or kind of, if you can cite one or two examples, what kind of mistakes did they talk about, or failures?
You mean in that time that we had?
Yeah,
Yeah,
these
yeah.
2-3 people who
Oh,
came.
yeah.
Okay.
Um, actually, interestingly, Vikram, they talked about, kind of like you mentioned about your relationships, and unforgiveness and things like that. They talked about relationships that had sort of broken apart and what they had done and how they would have done it differently. And yeah, actually, one of the persons talked a little bit about their marriage that had broken apart, and they were very vulnerable.
Right.
And they just said, "Here's, I think it was just about open communication. Actually, we're talking about open communication, and they were just speaking about how I was closed, and I closed myself off, and I didn't, and how then from that, the relationship broke apart, but I just realized I need to be open in my closest relationships and vulnerable, and that was one of the things that stood out to me that I remember. Yeah. Actually, one of them was also about forgiveness, interestingly, and to be able to let go.
Yeah.
And holding on to that unforgiveness and that bitterness and what effect it had on them. Sometimes it has a physical effect on people.
Right.
And this is actually, I think Johns Hopkins has a whole list of effects of unforgiveness
Wow.
and how it, heightens your blood pressure and
Right.
cortisol cortisol levels go up and up, and different, it actually has a physical effect on you. And this is scientific,
Unforgiveness,
right?
huh?
Unforgiveness. And again, this is why I'm such a promoter of forgive, and forgive, Jonathan. You should forgive, because it has an effect on us physically.
Right.
Unforgiveness, and they were talking about how it had an effect. And just on that subject, you have a good friend. He talks about this failure he had, and he doesn't talk about it as a failure, but he talks about something that he held on to. It was unforgiveness, and it was something that he was not as aware of, but it was there. And so in that, it was actually against his father, and it had, he just held on to it, and it was there in the back.
Right.
And how when he released it, it had a physical effect on him, to that he was having certain ailments, and those ailments, and he has evidence of this. When that time where he was able to release, the ailments left.
Wow.
Which is fascinating. And I think that's true. And this is why forgiveness is so important. And it's bigger than psychological safety, right? Is because it has such an effect, and it's a spiritual thing too. I think most faiths, if not many faiths, talk about forgiveness. It talks about it for different reasons. As I'm a Christian, we forgive because God has forgiven us, and that's the core of it. All that we've done wrong, in Jesus, there is forgiveness, if you will accept it. And so there's different reasons for it. And obviously there is power in it. And, as a Christian, it's about what God has done for us. And so we do it for others, and it's the highest form of love. And, that's the beautiful thing in it. But there are other motivations for forgiveness. And so
you mentioned Jesus. What did Jesus say about forgiveness?
many things. What comes immediately when you say that is, when his disciples, and he was talking about forgiveness, and his disciples came up to him, and I think it's Peter who says, "How many times should I forgive?" And, to summarize, Jesus also says 70 times 7, and it really, this multiplication, is more than you can count almost. Just keep on forgiving. And that they said, because he says, if someone forgives you, if someone comes to you and offends you or does something against you, forgive them. And if they come back and say apologize or repent, forgive them again. And then they say how many times. That's the context, right? And he just says, keep on forgiving. Essentially, that's the point, right? And so that was his core teaching. One of his core teachings is, if you want to be like God, if you want to be like me, keep on forgiving and keep on releasing. Yeah, and he says other things too, like in the context of he says if you don't forgive others, and it's really the standard that you use on others, God will use on you, and that's quite sobering, and he says, well, if you don't forgive others, will God forgive you, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's another part of the Christian faith.
Is there a good time to forgive, or what is the right time to forgive?
Now, and I don't say that flippantly. And I don't say that in an ultimatum sort of way, like you have to forgive now or else. I'm just saying I think we have to always start now, um, and it's a process, and it may not happen in a week or a month, and it may happen over time, but I think we have to move towards it for many reasons, but many of them I've said,
Mm-hmm.
even physically.
Right.
But for flourishing, I think we have to let go and keep on letting go. I I had a little bit of a conflict with a man, and this was a few years ago. I was actually teaching a conflict course,
Mm-hmm.
and I was convicted that I should go to this man. And maybe things weren't right between us.
Mm-hmm.
From my side, it was okay, but I felt that it wasn't, maybe from his side, and maybe even in the background there was some unforgiveness. And so I just, I sort of put a branch out there and said, would you like to meet? And he was very gracious, and he said he'd like to meet. And we had breakfast together. It was awkward, but we were able to talk. And I think even from that conversation, where me saying this is how I saw it, and again, it goes back to sharing each other's stories and perspectives. I think is so important. But it was about the conflict, and we were able to
Mm-hmm.
share. And even though he didn't say "I forgive you," I could tell by the language that he
Mm-hmm.
used and the way that he spoke to me that he was releasing something,
Mm-hmm.
as we spoke. And after that, interestingly, the relationship has changed and we're quite cordial with each other. Whereas before we weren't as much, there
Mm-hmm.
was, and I think that reaching out to people, even where there may be sort of this behind the back, unforgiveness, something that we don't see directly in either part is quite important. And so I would promote that again. Whew, not easy.
Not yet. Can everyone be forgiven, irrespective of what they've done?
By me, by you, by who? Does everyone have the potential to forgive? Yes, absolutely. I believe that. I believe in the human capability to forgive. I have hope in that. And so, yes, I mean, if you talk about from a spiritual level, I can talk about from a Christian level, from Christian understanding, the understanding is God can forgive all things. Yeah.
Let's talk about people, since we're talking about forgiveness. What about the people who have done so much atrocity and killed people and
Yeah.
there's mass murders?
Yeah.
For example, I was recently working with a lady on a script, which was on Nuremberg
Yeah.
trials,
Yeah.
and Hermann Goering
Yeah.
was one of the survivors there, and he was a commander in chief,
Yeah.
and probably the right hand, along with Goebbels and other guys, and Himmler, Goebbels, and
Yeah.
Hermann Goering.
Yeah.
And Hermann Goering was arrested alive. He was brought to the court, and he was convicted among the 20-something people, and
Yeah.
11 were on death row,
Yeah.
And so, can somebody like that? The big question of that, working on that, was how do we portray his character? Can he be? There was a chaplain, an
Yeah.
American chaplain, who was visiting him.
Yeah.
And so this lady who had done the research
Yeah.
had met with somebody from their family, from his family, and plus the granddaughter of Hermann Goering, who was
Yeah.
alive at that time. So she had like quite in-depth, knowledge of that situation, how they felt at that time, and the conversation. She dug up a lot of records. But
Yeah.
anyway, long story short, the question was, what we were grappling with was, can a guy like that be forgiven? And you said by who? Of course, firstly by, who were at the end of that infliction or atrocity, those Jewish people, but then ultimately by God, because God is the one. They might never be able to forgive, but God can always forgive. Now, the question is then, how can God forgive?
Right.
Right? Because, as I was not the one, not my people died, but the people who were there at that time, the Jews, they've lost. And we've heard stories from survivors, they were torn apart. I've heard story where the baby was torn apart from the mother, and all the parents and the siblings went into the gas chambers, never came back. And what do you think about that? Can they forgive? Probably not. But how does God, why does God forgive such people? Or can he forgive?
Well, I mean, there are many questions in there. I mean, I would go to, I mean, let's talk about the people, right?
All right.
And I think it's quite a famous story, right, of Corrie ten Boom, whose parents died and sister died in a concentration camp in World War II. She was in the concentration camp. She became a popular writer and speaker after going through all of that. One of her sessions, older man comes up to her, and she looks at him and he looks at her, and he starts talking, and she realizes this is one of the guards in the camp, who had been so hurtful to her and her sister, and actually I think had a hand in the death, if I'm right in saying that, a hand in the death of her relatives. And so here's someone who literally
Right.
was someone who was part of the murder of her closest relatives. And she said, in this quote, and I'm just summarizing it, how she says how she struggled with that, talking to him, but at the end of the conversation, she released it, and was able to forgive. And I believe he apologized, but I'm not 100% sure of that. But despite that, it doesn't matter. From her perspective, she was able to release it, and that, I would say that's true forgiveness. Something that I think we can all look towards, as an example of real forgiveness. And I'm taken to, and you ask, can God forgive, right? How can God forgive murder, horrible murder, genocide, pogroms, all of that? I'm taken to when Jesus was being crucified, murdered, and as he was being murdered and the guards were around him who were doing the crucifixion, Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." He wanted them to be forgiven, number one. He believed that God could forgive them. Those two aspects. And so that seems to be, I would say from that perspective, there seems to be the ability for God to forgive the worst of the worst. Of course, in Christianity, it's Jesus who pays this price. And so there is justice at the same time as forgiveness, and the price is paid by God himself. And that's actually the core teaching. And I think that is a very, very powerful thing to understand. It certainly had an effect on my life.
In what way?
I think it promotes letting go and forgiving others. And if I want to be a child of God, if I want to be someone who is godly, I have to move towards forgiveness in my relationships, no matter how hard it is or how much someone has hurt me. And that is always transformational, I think, if we're able to really do it. Yeah, I'm just, I'm taken to even seeking forgiveness in my own life, I think we have to do that. Like I said, we will hurt people deeply, and sometimes unwittingly, unknowingly. But moving towards saying, I made this mistake, please forgive me, I, I don't think we should be doing that in a way that is just, speaking all the time. I think we need to be very sincere in doing that. But I think also for us, seeking forgiveness, there's two ways to it.
Right. Is there anybody that you haven't forgiven in your life?
It's interesting, as we've had this conversation on forgiveness, I wasn't expecting to have such a long conversation on forgiveness. There's one person who I have, I think I've given them a bit of silent treatment, and I was actually thinking about that. As I was talking about passive revenge, and I think I need to reach out to them in the next day or two, and you can hold me accountable to that, and just
Definitely.
talk to them,
Right.
And it hasn't been so direct, but they've done something and said some things that have taken me aback, and I think as a result of that, I've sort of passively, shown them some numbness. And so I think I should talk to them. And so that's something I should do. And I'll try and do that in the next couple of days here. Yeah.
That's great. That's amazing. I mean, like you said, I was not, this was not in the list of questions, but it very naturally went in that direction. And sometimes these are the most beautiful moments that take us down that path, and we discover things that we have to, deal with or resolve.
Easy to talk about, right?
Yeah.
We can talk about forgiveness, but like even as I'm saying that, I should forgive them. It's like, oh, how am I going to do that? It's like this ping pong ball on fire in your mind, like dung 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 dung, going like, how should I do this? That's the difficulty, right? You're kind of fighting with yourself, right?
Exactly.
I don't want to go and speak to them, right? But I need to.
Yeah, I remember a couple of years ago, there was a lady who visited. Actually, we used to do transformational stories. So she was a German lady, and we had interviewed her. And after the interview, like we became like friends or acquaintance. And one day she visited us, and we were talking about different things and all. And it came up at that time. I was having some, this kind of thing, silent treatment, like you said, and I had some distance from this person. I was not talking to the person, and she said, "Vikram," like she cut me while I was talking. She said, "No, you don't have to explain anything. You don't have to go down that route. Just forgive right now. Forgive." And I was like, how can she say forgive without knowing the whole context and all? But she said, it doesn't matter. And now in retrospect, in hindsight, I can say she was right. And what I've learned through that, till today, it is not that I got that, that apology, so to say, or that person realized. I said, that person has to realize that he did wrong, and that person has to come to me and apologize or feel apologetic. And she was like, no, it doesn't matter. That's not that part. It's not. And I always thought forgiveness was like two-way thing. But I said, no. Even if the other person is not, they're not ready, because I thought I want that person to be ready. And I will create all that communication, whatever signals I can send out for that person to be in that position. No. And I didn't take it in that right way, because of course I was so hurt when I was talking about that and telling her. She said that, but now I can, looking back.
Yeah, and it's actually often mismatched.
Yeah.
So that's where the onus is on us. We say we can forgive from our side. And the reality of life is it's not always, you don't always reconcile, and I think forgiveness and reconciliation are two different things. I want to move towards reconciliation, but it doesn't always happen. And so I would say that, from our side, what can we do? Yeah, absolutely.
What do well-meaning parents unintentionally do to their children when they silence them? When they...
Well, I think you can unintentionally stifle growth. I think you can stop kids from being themselves, You can, sort of mold them into a form. You have to do this. You can't
Right.
say this. You shouldn't do this. So we have to be wary of that, and very careful of the way
Yeah.
that we disallow our kids from doing, or saying certain things. Again, we want to be parents who discipline. We want to have standards, and so I really promote that. But silencing kids, that was the term you used, um, from speaking openly. I think we have to be careful of that.
Is there a culture or a kind of a pattern or a routine that we can create in our families where we have open talk? Or is there an appropriate time to talk and not to talk? For example, we're sitting, husband and wife, you talking, and kid comes up. And let's say it's not even very important, but you're engrossed, you're talking about something, maybe your plans or maybe your whatever. Is that a good time when a kid comes? Because growing up in India, it was like, oh, jab do bade baat kar rahe ho, when two elders are talking, kids should not interrupt. I've heard this growing up. What do you think of that? Is that appropriate for do? Like as parents, now all parents that are listening right now, when your kids approach you and want to have that access, do you like just stop and give them that attention, or you shut them out or silence them?
Yeah, there's a middle ground there, right? Is that you should be able to have a conversation with your spouse, with your partner, in a way that is, uninterrupted. I think that
Yeah.
from others generally, not just kids. You should have that place. Silence them, right? I wouldn't say,
Mm. Yeah.
um, mom and dad are just having a conversation, would just be another 5 minutes. If you can just wait, we'll talk to you. Open explanation. I'm a proponent of that,
Okay.
of being able to explain it, especially in a brief way like that, to your kids, rather than pushing them off. How you do it again is important. And so you can do that in a loving way. And
Right.
so that's what I would say. But I would say we need to have spaces where we can talk, and not, have constant. And I think that's, I feel we have to model, right? We always have to model good conversations, because that example is often being followed. And so, not interrupting and helping people again. But when you say, how dare you do this? This will be your consequence. This is what, it's, that we have to be careful of that, when people, just to answer your question. I also think we should, and just, you said, how can we model this in the family? What can we do? I think we need to have times regularly, daily, where we have conversations with each other, where we check in, where we see how we're doing, where we see if we're all okay. And I think we have to model that and be vulnerable and say, I'm struggling. I mean, yesterday I was struggling with something, no, I had a bunch of people coming over, and I needed to speak to them,
Right.
and I needed to facilitate a conversation, and I was tired. I wasn't feeling very well. And I just told my daughter, I was like, please help me, like pray for me, just please be with me, because this is my 6-year-old daughter, actually. And she was so sweet. She said, it's okay, Dad, and I just said, I'm not doing well right now. I'm struggling. Like I want, and to be vulnerable like that, and she really accepted it well. And when you're not doing well, to be open and to be accepting when that happens to others. I think that's a beautiful thing. I think it's a powerful thing. I think it's a very safe environment that we create when we're vulnerable like that with each other, especially at home.
How vulnerable or weakness can you show to your children as parents? How much of it? Because children also need to have the safety. Like, I've seen my parents in vulnerable situation as a child growing up. And to me, it was like I don't want to go into the details, but where you feel like, oh, I don't feel psychologically, I don't feel safe. my mind was not analyzing, but I felt really uncomfortable.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I would have to know that, to make a judgment call on that, I would love to
Yeah.
know the context, but I
Yeah.
don't know if we can make a gauge on that. What I would say, Vikram, is we want to be open and
Open.
vulnerable. Um, there should perhaps be a reason why we're not vulnerable, and open. Is it just to hide,
Mhm.
who we are, or is there some other reason? But I would say this, all of us, sometimes get angry at our kids, or we make mistakes, or we say things we shouldn't have said. And the practice of saying, sorry, I said this to you, Ajia, and I'm sorry, I should not have said that, and please forgive me. This is, I'm sorry I did that. That practice, that's modeled, and that is something that is, I always try and be, and I don't always succeed, but try and be the first person to apologize. And I think with kids too, it's not just for parental relationships. I think it's every way, even with other close relationships. Um, that is something that creates safe environments, right?
Yeah.
Is that, they're being vulnerable. I mean, there's vulnerability in asking, in apologizing. Actually, there's maybe more vulnerability in apologizing, right, to
Right.
people if you've messed up. And I think that's a very powerful practice.
Now we know that speaking up requires courage,
Yeah.
right? There's a lot of consequences we talked about, or the fear factors that we have, shaming and being silenced and all of that. But do you think sometimes it's braver to remain silent and not speak? And in what situations?
Yeah, I mean, to answer the question, I think it could be. Yeah. As far as which situations, they say choose your battles, right? When should you speak up for something?
Right.
Because, we can't have a battle all the time,
Right.
right? And if something's going on and repeating itself, and so you have to decide, when do I speak up for this? So I think there's a place for discernment in when we speak up or speak out for or against something. Um, and there's timing, I'm a believer in that, timing and context. And so I don't think it means, to answer your question, I don't think it means just saying everything openly, all the time,
Right.
and that's where there is discernment. What it is saying is, are we allowing people to be open, right? And the finger on us is saying, am I creating that context for people to be open and to speak up? And I think that's the more important piece that we have some control over.
What happens to a person who has tried to speak but has been shut down repeatedly over a long period of time?
Trauma, they leave, they are completely, in distress, and it's not a nice place to be in. And, I wouldn't wish that for anybody. Not easy. I don't think there's any solution for it, Vikram. And I know people in those situations where they've tried to speak up against things. If they, they could leave, but they don't have the security, or a job or whatever it is. And so it's a really hard place to be in. I think we need to support those types of people, who have tried to speak up. I think it takes a lot of courage to do.
Have you ever been in a situation where you felt psychologically unsafe, where you're not able to speak, or it required a lot of effort on your part?
Yeah, I mean, I've been in situations where I felt I couldn't say anything, and like well, no, not couldn't say anything. I wasn't. People weren't open to hear my voice, and so that's happened several times. Over time, as you grow in relationships, you hope that people are able to hear you. This is what happened, to me. Once or twice, I was able to eventually speak into a situation. But yeah, no, it's I think most of us would say we've been in environments that haven't felt safe. the biggest hope I have is the environments I create are safe, for people, because we can so easily, sometimes unconsciously, create environments that just people can't be open and can't be themselves, and that's sad.
Mm. Can confidence to speak be rebuilt once it's been broken? Like in this case that I said,
Yeah.
somebody who's been repeatedly shut down.
Yeah.
Can that person's confidence be rebuilt in this situation again? And how?
Yeah, I am a believer in any type of reconstruction, but it takes time. And so, yes, I think they would need to go through a lot of discussion and dialogue
Right.
to get to that place, and it would take a lot of time. But yeah, I'm in the camp that there is hope in every relationship for the better.
So talking about hope, what is one thing that you can say that the listeners can learn to create safer environments?
Yeah, I think number one, we should be cognizant of safety in our families first, or those we're closest with,
Right.
where we're saying, is this safe?
Yeah.
Is this a place where people can be themselves? They can be open, they can make mistakes, they can be free. I think that awareness is
Right.
the number one for all of us, whether you're a teacher, whether you're, the medical profession, whatever it is. Hierarchy can often make that difficult.
Yeah.
And for those of us who are in some type of higher hierarchy, we, because there's a sort of standard that people want to live up to, there's already a structure in place.
Right.
And so I think we have to ask the question, are they able to speak openly? Am I allowing them, or creating that? And maybe it's not even to me, it's to each other. We've been doing 360 reviews, if you're familiar with that, where you get, between, 6 and 12 people to review you, and it could be your wife, it's usually from different spheres of your life,
Okay.
your colleagues and others, your superiors.
How many? 6 to 12 people.
Yeah, I mean, generally they'll do that many, sometimes they do more.
Okay.
And you ask them questions, and even critiques,
Right.
what are some things that are, that Jonathan needs to work on. I actually had this last year. And we actually made it anonymous. But interestingly, in our context, if you make it anonymous, people might say anything, and even things that are not helpful. And so what we did is we made it anonymous, but we had someone curate it. So they took the information and they saw what is helpful, maybe what's not helpful, and they were able to present it to the person. This was presented to me.
So the people who gave the feedback were knew this person that they were, writing about.
Yeah. They related to them. They related to them in either a colleague, a coworker, the boss.
Yeah.
Usually, you do have your boss or someone else, who's there, and so you get that's the idea: 360 perspective.
360,
good
okay.
and maybe negative also. Some
And
things you need to work
this
on.
person who they're doing this
So
thing
I had
on.
it done to me. Yeah.
Yeah. So done to you. Did you know who were involved? All the people, or is it anonymous?
No, I knew who
you
was
knew
involved.
the 612 people,
Yes,
or whatever.
but their feedback was curated, and that some parts were.
Okay, so you didn't have individual thing, but it was curated, put together, and
they said, these are what 4 people said you need to work on this.
Right.
5 people said you're doing great at this. It was very helpful. I had to really open myself up to it.
Wow.
Right? You have to really.
I can imagine that. Yeah.
And that is, if you're willing to do a review like that, or not even willing. If you're saying, I need to do a review like this,
Right.
if I'm a boss or a director or whoever it is, and getting that, because that's not easy to get that kind of feedback, right? And you're kind of making yourself open and vulnerable, and then working with someone. I would recommend, a coach or someone to help change those, things that you need to work on. That's a good way. And what I liked about it is in our context, the shame context, shame honor context. If it's completely anonymous, it can be a bit difficult. So you have someone help you in that
Right.
process, and so that I would be an advocate for that.
What is one habit that people can stop immediately to creating unsafe environment? Is there a habit that we often do, unwittingly do, that we should stop?
Yeah. Ask yourself: am I shaming the people closest to me? How am I doing it? What phrases might I be using? Because it's very common, and I've realized that as I've talking to people, that people they almost have an aha moment, and they'll say, "Oh, I'm doing this with my kids. I'm saying that, right? Usually I say this to my wife," and so think through what are the and I mean maybe even asking those around you, are there comments I make that are backhanded, that are making you feel, you know, difficult, out of place? That's, I think that's the introspection we have to have. And so I think we do need to do a little bit of self-awareness. And so that's a good exercise to say, what language am I using? And, it starts with awareness. Vikram. I think it's such a big, great leadership trait. If we don't have that awareness, how can we change? And so we have to do a little bit of mirroring, right? Take the mirror, hold the mirror up to myself and say, what things am I saying that may be not creating safe spaces?
Our program is called Courage Coach, and where we talk about courage and helping people overcome their anxieties, fears, or whatever is holding them back to moving towards their goal, their vision, their purpose in life. What does courage mean to you?
I think, Vikram, what immediately comes to mind is standing up for what's right and doing what is right too. And I think that is real wisdom too, to be courageous, to act on doing what is right. I would say, especially it's courageous when it's in the face of difficulty or challenge or struggle that we still do what's right. So I would say that's the core definition for me.
What do, in our environment and today, what area of their lives people need most courage for? You said from a personal perspective, but do you see today in our society where is the place where they are lacking courage?
Yeah. I see many places. I think the courage to speak up in one in the national context, to see if you see something is wrong, to actually say it, or at least have a voice in some way. I think in a family environment, it's the courage to introspect and seeing what do I need to do differently to make my family flourish and grow, here. That's courage. I think on a organizational level, there's courage to often hold to your values and belief, even when others may be against them, and speaking up for that. I think that's courageous. And so I think you can find courage in every aspect of our lives. And it's certainly my desire to walk more towards courage.
If we created safe environments, if we created psychological safety at our workplace as well as in our families, what would change in the family? What would change in the community?
I think we'd have much more growth among colleagues and workplaces, and I think people would be growing in their skills and their knowledge, in wonderful ways and accelerated ways, I think we'd have much more innovation and creativity. I think we'd be doing things much better, more efficiently, because people have ideas and good ideas often. I think we'd have less conflict and strife in our teams and organizations, because people can be open with each other and they can feel open and they can talk candidly to each other without taking a grudge. And I think those things would be very powerful, if we all moved towards more psychological safety.
Can you give us last practical pointers or steps that the audience can take away today from this podcast and start applying psychological safety, or start creating environments with psychological safety right where they are?
Yeah, I mean, I would say you could do like a mini survey. If you have a team, you could do it in your family too. And you could say, what language do we use that is not safe? And then you could say, what is the language we use that could be safer, that could make this more safe? And you just do it, and you can get, whoever it is involved, and you can do it informally, you can do it formally. I think it's a good place to start, because it brings a realization, this awareness that, there may be language we're using that is actually stifling so much of our relationships and the way that we're working together. And so I think that, just in an informal way, we can be doing that. That's a good place to start, I think. I've seen it work with teams, yeah.
Jonathan, thank you so much for talking with us. That was a long session, but I think so. You spoke a lot of wisdom and about psychological safety that I had not heard before. And it really throws light on a very important issue about creating psychologically safe environments at our workplace, in our homes and our community. Thank you so much. Appreciate that. And ladies and gentlemen, if you drew value from this, if you found it beneficial, and if you found it interesting, please do like, subscribe, and share it with somebody who wants to know it. In fact, everybody needs to hear this. More people need to hear it about creating psychological safety right where they are in their families and their workplace. And I remember one proverb. What I got personally from this conversation is, it all begins with communication and speaking words of life, speaking words that are uplifting, building. And so you can start right there where you are. Watch what you say, check your intent, your motivation of saying that, and it should be something to build and not to tear the other person down. Thank you for watching. Stay strong, stay courageous. See you next time. Bye-bye. Jonathan.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, brother.